What is up, you guys? Welcome back to Tidal Gardens. The question of the day is it possible to have a tank that is just too clean? Short answer is yes, but there are buts involved. So, starting from the very top, it's the entire idea of a reef. And when you look at oceans, a natural reef is a nutrient desert. If you're looking at anything measurable like nitrates and phosphates, they're practically zero. So, in essence, a lot of where we get our corals from are extremely clean waters. Like most things with the ocean, things don't always translate. We often strive to replicate the ocean, but I think that often comes from not actually having been to the ocean. Because if you've ever been scuba diving, that's a reality check that you're probably never going to be able to replicate what's going on. The flow, not happening. Ocean currents are so strong that the idea that you're going to replicate anything remotely similar in a 4 foot long tank, that ain't happening. The lighting, completely different. To put it into perspective, during low tide, there's a lot of corals that are straight up exposed to direct tropical sunlight during midday. 3,000 par with no water. That sort of stuff isn't a thing in our home aquariums. Just like the dynamics of the biology is completely different. So, for example, we don't have great success keeping clams here. One time I was on vacation and there were maxima clams all over the place. And during midday, tide goes out, it exposes all these clams to the air. And you would think that, well, these clams are going to close up and everything to protect themselves. No, not so much. Completely open, mantle still extended out of the water, and then it starts to rain on them. And for the next few hours during low tide, they're just getting fresh water dumped on them. And this is totally normal for them, not an issue at all. In my tanks, I so much as look at a clam wrong, it dies. Clearly, there's a lot of differences. So we really can't take all of our cues from the ocean. So, as far as whether a tank can be too clean, I kind of have to approach it both as a hobbyist and as a coral farmer because there are some major trade-offs that are associated with both of those types of tanks. So, for a home hobbyist, yes, it is absolutely possible to keep a tank that is too clean. And the sort of issues that you might run into are if you completely bottom out your nutrients. So, your phosphates and nitrates are effectively zero. Not a problem in the ocean, it's going to be a problem in your home aquarium. That's because there's kind of like this sweet pocket where corals are going to do really well, where stuff like coralline algae is going to do really well. And that pocket is where nitrate is going to be between 5 parts per million and about 20 parts per million. Anything in that range, most things are going to be very flexible. An SPS keeper that's keeping a lot of acropora, they might want to keep their nutrients closer to that 5 part per million range. Whereas somebody with slightly dirtier water, uh, things like elegances and a lot of large polyp stonies like it a little bit dingier. And you can even escalate that up a little bit more for things like soft corals. We actually have a non-photosynthetic tank here where we feed somewhat heavily because you kind of have to. The nitrate level of that tank is between 50 to 100. We're trying to bring it down, but it's not affected the health of the corals at all. Yes, slightly elevated nutrients compared to the ocean, but you do want to stay in that pocket. Similarly, phosphate, we're looking at zero point zero 0.05 on the lower end to 0.2-ish on the upper end, something in that ballpark for phosphate. When you go too high on either of those nutrients, you run into the risk of kind of encouraging problematic algae and stuff. But if you go too low, if you completely bottom those out, now you run into weird like dinoflagellate slimes and things like that, which could be substantially worse than problematic algae. In that sense, too clean is a very real thing. The other thing that you might run into with having a tank that's too clean is there was some expectation for this type of nutrient to feed your animals. You might run into filter feeders that aren't quite so happy. You might run into corals that are bleaching out just because they're basically starving. You might run into a lack of microbiome, which could manifest in certain things that like to pick on these little creepy crawlies like amphipods and whatnot. Because if you kind of nutrient limit those, then certain fish and certain corals and certain inverts that you do want to keep, they kind of relied on picking on those independent of when you're feeding your tank. So you might run into issues like that. Perhaps the biggest downside to keeping a tank that's too clean, this isn't necessarily tied to nutrients specifically. If you've ever introduced a brand new, completely clean dead rock to your tank, what tends to form on that rock isn't coralline algae. It's going to be some kind of gross slime, whether it's going to be like hair algae or it's going to be like some kind of dinoflagellate or something. Originally, I was thinking, well, it's because like this rock hasn't really gotten done leaching out its nutrients, but what's really going on is the fact that it's a blank canvas for anything to grow. And generally speaking, what grows, it's going to be something slimy, something hairy and gross. And it kind of takes some herbivore activity to mow that down to eventually let something that's not as problematic like coralline algae to take its place. Now, there are upsides to doing a lot of heavy maintenance to your tank. And I'm not talking about just the general maintenance of, doing like a 15% water change every couple of weeks and stuff. That's what I consider a normal, healthy level of maintenance on your tank. I'm talking about going a little bit extra crazy. There are definitely some benefits. So, one of the benefits is that straight up, you are spending a lot more time actually in your tank. Observation and really kind of digging around like the dark, neglected areas of the tank has some major benefits because just the act of observation, you're going to avoid so many issues. There's a difference between just kind of like sitting back and appreciating your tank and really digging in and doing maintenance. Kind of getting in there more, you're going to catch a lot of things before they become real problems. The other thing is, especially if you're doing a lot of siphoning of detritus piles and whatnot, or going through your substrate and siphoning that more aggressively, you are going to minimize the risk of what I would call nutrient sink problems. Because things like your rock, your substrate, if you have a substrate, or just piles of detritus if you have no substrate, those are what I would call nutrient sinks. Things like your refugium as well. They're really good at processing a lot of your tank's nutrients, holding onto detritus and whatnot. The problem is usually when you exceed the nutrient sinks capacity to manage all that, things go down a hill in a hurry. If you're able to get in there and kind of maintain that more frequently, you don't run into that sudden ecosystem collapse. Some might argue that it kind of defeats the purpose of that, but just speaking from experience, it's kind of like a titration. Everything is fine, you're like dripping, 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 and then bang, at some point, the entire solution changes color. That's kind of what a nutrient sink does at the point of collapse. Getting in there, cleaning that stuff out, you kind of extend that timeline. And the last big benefit I would say is that it just kind of looks nice. It's always looking nice and polished. But that does also come with the downside of it being kind of unsustainable. And this is where I'm guilty on all accounts on this, because I like to try to keep our tanks here what I would call borderline unsustainably clean. And it's a frustrating process because you can never really maintain it to that degree. I mean, I personally try to siphon about 60 gallons per day, and it's not just to remove the water. It is specifically using the water as a vehicle to remove detritus and to like really get in there and scrub off some surfaces that have grown too much coralline and things like that. So it is a very intensive process of trying to clean. And the tanks really do look good. But if you just like skip a couple of days, like I said before, there's going to be a lot of things that are going to be happily growing where you just cleaned. And it's not going to be something that's nice and purple and solid. It's going to be something slimy and gross. We have to rely on our herbivores and things like snails and urchins to kind of like maintain it a little bit better. But again, removing detritus piles, that's going to be on you. Those are the types of things that are going to grow like red slime and things like that. This is something that's kind of specific to a coral farm. That's not really so much something you're going to see in like a home aquarium, but we do a lot of our growing on these like really nice custom acrylic racks. And eventually those acrylic racks are going to grow stuff like coralline. It's going to cover our labels we do have to get in there and clean those up. And we take them out, we clean them, we soak them in acid to get all traces of coralline off of it, put it back into the tank. They look amazing. The problem is, once again, it is a blank canvas. So instead of having coralline algae, now you're going to have green hair algae. You're going to have like the brown film type stuff. You might even get some kind of like weird red stuff. Who knows? But it's kind of this constant process of cleaning trays. It's something that works well in a farm, but again, it kind of like brushes up against that unsustainably clean. Because when we are able to clean to that degree, what is nice is that it gives us an idea of like when was the last time that we really cleaned the corals on this tray? Because if that tray is just covered with natural growth, I can pretty much guarantee that those corals haven't been dipped in a while. Those corals haven't been fragged in a while. Now's probably a good time to take a look because neglect is one of the worst things to happen on a coral farm. And so that kind of is a built-in timer, like a visual timer. Like if you can't read the label, if you can't see the acrylic on a tray, you're only seeing coralline, it's time to get in there. But is it too clean? In a way, kind of, because again, you're battling these kind of uglier, problematic algae that simply aren't there in a more mature system. I guess the last thing I'll bring up, and this is kind of a problem with a system that is too clean, that's bumping up against an unsustainable standard, is that this is supposed to be a fun hobby. And when you're in there cleaning to that degree, ignoring all the other problems that you're actually doing to your tank, potentially, it's not that fun to be that neurotic about keeping it so pristine. You're getting into the not fun aspects of the hobby. There's less time to sit back and just appreciate, and it's more time just to curate to that level. Maybe people out there do enjoy it, but I liken it to the folks that are trying to keep their lawn, golf course, putting green perfect. It's not a fun space all the time. So, anyways, guys, that pretty much does it for here. Talk to you guys later. Happy reefing.